The ambulance tore through the storm, tires slicing through rivers of rain on the rural road. Trees bowed under the weight of the downpour, and the flashing lights of the sirens blurred into streaks across the windshield. Inside, Elena gripped the dashboard, squinting through the sheets of water. Visibility was near zero. Just as they rounded a sharp bend, the driver slammed the brakes with a shout. The vehicle jolted violently. In the center of the road stood a lone golden retriever, drenched, shivering, yet unmoving. His fur was soaked and matted, clinging to his fragile frame, and blood streamed from one front paw. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stared through the windshield, chest heaving, rain dripping from his muzzle. The driver honked. The sirens howled. Still, the dog refused to move. He stood like a statue carved by desperation. "He's going to get himself killed," the driver yelled. But Elena leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing. There was something in the dog's gaze, not fear, not confusion, but focus, an ache, a plea. "He's not lost," she said quietly. "He's trying to stop us. He wants us to follow." For a second, no one moved. The road stretched endlessly behind them, but the dog's eyes pointed forward, off the pavement, into the dark. Elena opened the door and stepped out into the rain. As Elena stepped cautiously toward the dog, he didn't flinch or bark. There was no fear in his body language, only urgency. Rain poured off his soaked coat, his ribs faintly visible beneath the wet fur. He took a few limping steps toward the trees on the side of the road, then stopped, turning his head slowly to look back at them. His eyes were wide, not just with desperation, but with a heartbreaking kind of hope, the kind that clings to a thread in the darkest hour. "He's leading us somewhere," Elena said, her voice low but firm. "We need to follow him." The other medic hesitated, then nodded, with sirens still echoing into the woods behind them. They grabbed their flashlights and medical kits and plunged into the rain-drenched undergrowth. The dog moved ahead, cautious but determined, his paw dragging slightly as he limped through the mud and fallen branches. Despite the cold and pain, he didn't stop. His tail hung low, legs trembling from exhaustion, but his head remained pointed forward. Every few steps, he paused to check if they were following. Then, without warning, he barked, a short, piercing cry that cut through the storm like a flare. A cry for help, for someone he couldn't carry alone. And with that, he disappeared into the dense curtain of trees, swallowed by the underbrush. The medics exchanged a look, then pushed on, hearts racing. The muddy slope grew steeper as they followed the dog deeper into the woods, their boots slipping over wet roots and slick soil. The rain had turned the ground into a treacherous descent, but the dog never stopped. Then, just as Elena's flashlight swept ahead, she froze. "There!" she shouted. Nestled in the gnarled arms of the forest floor was a mangled bicycle, twisted at the frame and half buried under wet leaves. And beside it, motionless, lay a boy, no older than 14. His limbs were awkwardly sprawled, his jeans torn, face nearly as pale as the rain itself. His lips were tinged with blue, and a slow, dark trail of blood ran from a wound on his temple. The dog rushed to him, whining loudly, and collapsed gently across the boy's chest, trying to keep him warm with his soaked body. His whimpers echoed with panic and sorrow. Elena dropped to her knees, checking for a pulse. Her hands trembled. "He's alive, but fading fast," she breathed, grabbing her radio with one hand and ripping open the emergency kit with the other. The boy was barely hanging on. The cold and blood loss were winning. The rain had nearly washed him away. If they hadn't been stopped, if that dog hadn't stood in their path, this boy would have died alone in the woods, unseen and unnamed. But now he had a chance. Elena and her partner worked quickly, wrapping the boy in thermal blankets, cleaning the blood for his face, and checking his vitals with trembling urgency. All the while, the golden retriever remained pressed against the boy's side, his soaked fur plastered to his ribs, his body shivering from cold and exhaustion. But he wouldn't move, not for the rain, not for the medics, not even when they gently nudged him aside to place the boy on a stretcher. He merely shifted closer, his eyes never leaving the boy's pale face. As the call for backup echoed through the radio, the team began the grueling ascent back up the muddy slope, one step at a time. The ground was slick, their boots struggled for grip, and the weight of the stretcher made every inch a battle. And yet, behind them, the dog followed, limping, stumbling, soaked to the bone, but never falling too far behind. With every slip, he caught himself. With every pause, he waited, eyes locked on the stretcher. When they finally reached the ambulance and loaded the boy inside, the dog climbed in without being asked. He found his place beneath the gurney, curling into a tight ball at the boy's feet, trembling from cold and fatigue. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He just stayed, guarding his boy with a kind of silent loyalty that words couldn't describe, a devotion so pure, even the medics exchanged glances, moved beyond speech. Inside the emergency room, under harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, the paramedics handed off the boy to the trauma team, soaked to the skin and shaking from adrenaline. Elena leaned against the wall, watching the gurney disappear behind swinging double doors. Minutes stretched endlessly. A nurse approached with a clipboard and asked what little they knew. It wasn't much. Then, another nurse came over holding the dog, now dry, gently wrapped in a towel, his golden fur fluffed from the heat lamps. Around his neck was a small, weather-worn tag. It read, Cooper. That changed everything. Within minutes, they had the boy's identity. His name was Aaron Blake, age 14. He had been missing for over 18 hours. His parents had been searching the woods, putting up flyers, fearing the worst. But no one had known where he was. No one could have known. Not until Cooper stood in the road, soaked and limping, refusing to let an ambulance pass. Elena sat in silence, processing it all. The boy was Cooper's. And Cooper, who could have run for shelter or hidden from the storm, had chosen instead to find the only people who could save his boy. They were inseparable, a neighbor would later say. That dog would have followed Aaron into a hurricane. And in a way, he had. If Cooper hadn't waited in the road, if he had been just 5 minutes later, Aaron would have died alone, buried in mud and rain. Let me know when you're ready. Hours dragged on as Aaron lay in surgery, his fate hanging by a thread, outside the operating room. Cooper sat quietly by the emergency entrance, his golden coat now dry, but still damp with a faint smell of earth and rain. The dog's eyes were fixed unwaveringly on the heavy metal doors, as if willing them to open. Nurses came and went, offering food and water, but Cooper refused. He was too focused, too anxious to eat or rest. Blankets were brought to keep him warm, but he didn't settle. His body trembled, not from cold, but from fear and exhaustion. Several times, the staff tried to coax him to lie down, but Cooper stayed upright, alert, never taking his gaze away from the door behind which his best friend fought for life. The storm outside had passed, and first light began to seep through the hospital windows, painting the sterile floor with pale gold. Elena sat beside Cooper, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew, didn't you? You never gave up on him. Cooper's tail was still, his breath steady but shallow. His eyes, full of hope and silent prayers, remained locked on the hallway beyond the door, waiting, hoping, as if to say, he's coming back. He has to. Late morning sunlight filtered softly through the hospital room window as Aaron's eyelids fluttered open. The sterile hum of machines and distant voices surrounded him, but his first coherent thought was clear. Where's Cooper? With a weak, croaking voice, he whispered, Where's Cooper? At that moment, a wave of relief swept through the nursing staff. Cheers broke out quietly in the hallway, and Elena hurried to the waiting area where Cooper sat patiently. The moment the dog caught sight of Aaron, his tail began to wag furiously, his eyes shining with joy and disbelief. Cooper bounded gently onto the bed, careful not to hurt his fragile friend, and nuzzled Aaron's face with tender affection. Tears streamed down Aaron's cheeks as he wrapped his arms tightly around the loyal golden retriever, sobbing into his warm, damp fur. The bond between them, tested by fear and darkness, had endured. Doctors called it a miracle, a rescue against all odds. But to Cooper, it was simply what love does. It waits without question, it never gives up, and it brings you back on the edge. In that quiet hospital room, two hearts beat strong again, a boy who was nearly lost, and a dog who refused to leave his side. 6 weeks later, the day finally arrived when Aaron could leave the hospital. Though his body was weak and his legs still couldn't support him, he was determined to go home. Cooper, ever faithful, led the way, his tail wagging gently as if to say, "We made it." The wheelchair rolled slowly down the familiar road, the same path where Cooper had stopped the ambulance in the pouring rain, where fate had hung in the balance. The neighborhood had heard the story, how a loyal dog had stood in the middle of the road, soaked and hurt, to save the boy he loved. Curious neighbors asked how Cooper had known exactly what to do, how a dog could stop a speeding ambulance in a storm. But the answer was simple, and it didn't require science or explanation. Love doesn't pause to think or calculate. Love doesn't wait for someone else to act. Love acts on instinct. It becomes a help when no one else can. And sometimes love takes the form of a dog, standing fearless in the rain, daring the world to stop. Because someone he loves is slipping away, and he refuses to let the world forget. In that moment, Cooper wasn't just a dog. He was love made flesh, an unyielding protector, a silent hero.